right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Stephanie Pedrosa, Senior Marketing Manager at Origo Software Technologies. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today in Origo's webinar series. And I also want to thank our partners today for helping us put this webinar together. And I hope we see you guys at an upcoming Infra Day later on this year. A little bit about Origo. We have been capital owners, including water authorities and water districts, manage their infrastructure programs for almost 2 decades now. And in today's webinar, we will discuss a topic that affects our public health as it has to do with water, which is a substance that is vital for all living things. And I'm sure everyone in the audience has either drank water, used water for some cleaning. I have my gallon jug here, so it's a very, very important topic. And today, industry experts in the water department will share how they're navigating through factors like climate change, population increase, and water scarcity that are unpredictable and make the delivery of water infrastructure a challenge. They will discuss how they're addressing these obstacles and building capital programs that meet strategic needs of for their communities. Now, a few quick notes before we get started. The webinar is recording, and we will provide all registered participants with a recording. The slides will also be provided to all registered participants. Now we ask that you submit any questions throughout the webinar via the Q&A chat box, and we'll answer questions at the end of the presentation. If for some reason we don't answer questions during the available time, we will follow up with you via email. And joining me today is my colleague and Marketing Director, Richard Kramer, who will be moderating today's webinar. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Stephanie. Great to be here.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. And now I'm really excited to introduce our panel of experts. And joining us today, we have Tom Hickman, the CEO for Tulane Water District with over 25 years of experience in all areas of water and utility master planning. He has been credited with bringing innovative ideas using technology to engage community involvement along with using technology in solving challenging issues. He is noted for championing a unique approach to big ticket infrastructure decision making and bringing these concepts to engineering audiences nationwide. Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And next we have Heather Dyer, the CEO and General Manager of San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District, who has launched the rebranding of the district and how it operates, including the near completion of the district's first ever strategic plan, a classification and compensation study, and the completion of the Upper Santa Ana River Habitat Conservation Plan, protecting 22 native species of the Santa Ana River watershed. She is also developing a climate resilience action plan for the district that will identify, mitigate, and adapt to the likely effects of climate change on the frequency and magnitude of long-term drought and catastrophic wildfires in the district's headwaters. Heather, thank you so much for joining us. And next we have Indra Martian, Director of Innovation and Technology and Alternative Delivery at Ontario Clean Water Agency. He has an extensive history of energy conservation and energy efficiency projects in water and wastewater sector. He was awarded the 2021's Water Next Award for top government leader in Canada's water industry and has dedicated his energy to delivering innovative infrastructure, energy, climate change, and resource solutions to over 200 municipal clients across Ontario. Indra, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Awesome. So now I'll hand it over to Richard and we'll start with the webinar.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. A very good afternoon to everyone in the audience from me. Welcome. Thanks for taking the time to join us this afternoon. I think it's a great time to talk about water and what's happening with our water infrastructure in both the US and Canada. Last year's bill here in the United States, the IIJA called for around a $55 billion level of investment in water. And similarly, the Investing in Canada Act from a few years ago set aside over $26 billion for water and other environmental projects. We have issues, as Stephanie mentioned, with climate change to contend with, a global pandemic that's been going on, the Great Resignation, issues with water quality, like I'm sure we've all seen the Flint, Michigan water crisis that's been making news headlines and continues to make news headlines. So we're here to break down some of those topics with our panel of experts, and you can see the rough agenda that we're going to follow in front of you. So let's dive right in. And I'd like to start with Tom. Tom, tell us a little bit about the infrastructure and the programs you have going on at Tualatin Valley Border District, what your agency manages, and some of the major initiatives you have going on.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. So we serve about 250,000 community members here, and we're just outside Portland, Oregon, just west of Portland. And we serve some major industries, chip manufacturing and clothing manufacturers here in the area, as well as the population. One of the challenges we have is this is a rapidly growing area. With that, it has stressed our resource. And so we have been looking for an additional resource, an additional supply of water. As part of that effort to get this additional supply of water, we've also taken on the issue of addressing seismic reliability. We are in what's called a Cascadia subduction zone, and that event occurs every about 100 to 150 years. We're currently behind, so we're due, in short. So as a result, we are making a $1.6 billion investment in a seismically resilient water supply off the Willamette River. This will give us now 3 different sources of water. With that, though, comes a lot of challenges. You have to understand, to get this supply, the work on this began in the 1970s. That's how long it takes to get through the permitting process to do these kinds of things. It does not happen quickly. So you have to have a long-term global lens when you're putting these kind of projects together. It's been a major challenge in terms of funding. Right now, we have not to date received any state or federal grant funds. We did get a low interest loan from the federal government, and that took quite a bit. We were actually involved in lobbying in the structure of developing what they call WIFIA loans, which is a low interest water infrastructure loan. So with that, that's probably enough for me. But we have plenty of challenges in front of us, including I forgot to mention is with climate change, the forest fires are a significant challenge for us as well, because they also threaten our water supply.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. And I think we're going to dive into a couple of those topics in a little bit. I was at a large transportation conference a couple of weeks ago, and there was a lot of similar sentiment around the IIJA funding, as what you said. So, I think we have a slide coming up on that in a little bit. I want to switch over to Heather. Heather, tell us what's going on in San Bernardino. Tell us about your agency, your programs, and some of the major things you're working on. Heather, I think you might be on mute. I can't hear you.
Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. So like Tom, we're taking a long-term approach to how we plan water infrastructure. This is not a, this year, next year, even in the next 5 years type of planning that we're doing. We are looking at what infrastructure do we need in place in 10 years, 15 years, 20, 50 years. So we ran up against quite a lot of environmental permitting challenges, which I'm sure Tom has experienced. And so the approach that we decided to take was a regional collaborative effort. And we had approximately 100 different water supply projects that we wanted to build. We couldn't get even one permit, so we decided to band together and develop a huge 875,000 acre habitat conservation plan that protects 22 endangered and threatened species. And it'll get us permits for the next 50 years worth of water projects. And that was the first major step that we took towards this really different way of looking at our complex problems related to water. And since that time, we've actually kind of modeled a lot of different efforts on that habitat conservation plan model, where there was 11 agencies. We banded together. We figured out, what do we need to build over the next 50 years. We looked at some of the constraints. We did all the things that you need to do, and we're starting to put that into action now. And so then, like Tom said, then the next hurdle was money. How are we going to pay for our 50 projects, 100 projects? And so thanks to the work that the people before me did on WIFIA, we were also invited to apply for a low interest federal loan that's basically funding. It's giving us 49% of the costs of the projects at low interest. That said, you still got to figure out how to come up with 51%, right? And pay back your loan over time. And so that was a real challenge. And trying to figure out the financing part of it is just so difficult. And it all comes together, right? Like, how do you put all the puzzle pieces in place?
Thanks, Heather. Indra, let's switch over to you. I know you're with Ontario Clean Water Agency, a major agency, probably the most populous area in Canada. How have things been going for you? What are some of the main things that you've been working on?
I echo what Tom and Heather says. I mean, even though we are situated, thousands of miles apart, the challenges are still same. However, I want to highlight that Canadian model, Ontario being the largest province in Canada, the wastewater system ownership and operations model is a little bit different than Tom and Heather mentioned. Here, we have about 444 municipal, or we call it municipalities or cities and towns. So they typically own the infrastructure. And Ontario Clean Water Agency, we operate on their behalf on a long-term contractual basis. So we operate about 15 billion in municipal clients' wastewater infrastructures and manage their assets on a long-term operating authority basis. But however, most of these system owners are small. Having said that, they don't have enough internal resources to work around capital investments or infrastructure renewal decisions. So AQUA, especially my department, in addition to the operations department, we support our municipal clients secure these fundings, identify, assess, develop, and implement these opportunities. So it's like a semi-consulting in nature, but we do that for a lot of our municipalities. Now, when the size becomes smaller, and a lot of our assets, based on the 2019 Canadian Infrastructure Report card, most of the assets are in a good conditions, but majority of these assets are 20 years and old. And now with the new pressure created by climatic events and whatnot, 20 years is old assets, and you need a really big cash injections to upgrade these assets in the names of efficiency or innovation or resiliency. And there's a lot of money that's being required to build those capacity and resilience in these assets. We have been very fortunate that the federal and provincial governments have stepped up to fill that gap. And like Heather is mentioning, but none of these funding programs provide you 100% money, right? You have to still come up with 25% or some sort of combinations. And usually the other challenges we have is wastewater rates in our province is very minimal. And it hasn't been indexed to the market inflation or consumer index, so it has lagged behind. So as your assets gets older, your need of renewal investment gets larger, but your rates hasn't kept up, right? Because it's municipally owned, small systems, small owners, so there's not a lot of revenue stream. So for a number of decades, all of these infrastructures, except the large ones down in larger cities like Toronto and southern cities, totally dependent on government funding. And we all know government fundings are not available every year. They come in cycles, right? Once in a 10 year, once in a 5 years. And that's why the investments hasn't been continuous. So there's a gap. And as the crumbling infrastructures starts happening, and we also, I don't know if you have seen, a lot of Ontario has been growing to a rapid growth. whether it's because of immigration or so forth. A lot of southwestern and eastern cities are growing. So some of these medium-sized cities are facing that economic growth and population growth pressure, and plants are old. Plants doesn't have sophisticated treatment systems, and then you have aging assets. So all these climatic events combined, the need of investment is today, not 5 years from now. So there's a lot of work to be done, and so governments are stepping up, as I said. But then the challenge is to deliver again. So recently, both levels of government approved around 144 water wastewater projects for funding. So now in Ontario, we don't have enough stakeholders to deliver it all at once, right? Ontario is so big, so a lot of stakeholders are working together how to get it done, and then all of us are facing supply chain issues and whatnots. The cost of materials, the cost of labor has gone up tremendously. Canada has just reported 6.5% inflation, combined with supply chain issues and whatnots. I think it's a difficult time. So money was a key barrier, Richard, but now it's being multiplied or amplified by supply chain issues, cost of material, labor needed to deliver these infrastructure projects and so forth.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. We didn't even talk about the sort of supply chain issues and the inflation, which is obviously impacting thing. That was another thing I heard at that transportation conference that I mentioned earlier. So let's maybe double click a little bit on some of those challenges. I know in your intros, the panelists, you've mentioned a couple of challenges that you're facing. I'd ask you maybe to pick one or two of those challenges just to give us a bit more context around them. And I'll start with Heather this time. So in terms of some of these challenges, Heather, maybe pick one. Can you tell us what you faced in delivering water to your community, or maybe challenges with delivering your actual capital program, and what you've done to address them?
Climate change. It's our number one challenge in Southern California, probably, I would say, globally related to water, because everything is exacerbated by climate change, right? The physical conditions on the landscape, it's drier, our snowpack doesn't last as long, there's a lot more evaporation, we have sea level rise in certain areas with saltwater intrusion, we have drought in the north, drought in the south in California here. And so it's just everything is amplified. And so the sense of urgency is that much more. And so we're not only planning for, something that Indra said is, the way that our infrastructure was built, probably starting in maybe the 60s, maybe even the 50s. But in California, so the State Water Project was designed and built in the 60s, 70s, 80s. That is constructed and designed with past conditions in mind. They never could have imagined that someone like Tom would be dealing with a major economic driver of chip manufacturing that has a huge demand on water supply. And so the way that our infrastructure is set up currently does not meet the current and future needs of our economy and of the people and of the environment. And then you layer on top of that climate change and all the uncertainty of hydrologic cycles. It's just very, very challenging. And the answer really is that we have to be proactive. We have to think big and long term, and we have to build in adaptive strategies. So for us, we have State Water Project is about 20% of our supply is imported from Northern California. Well, this year we got 5%. So we turn to our local resources. Groundwater that we've been saving. We basically buy and import and recharge as much water as we possibly can when it's wet, either locally or in Northern California. Stormwater capture projects. How do we build those big enough that they can withstand huge atmospheric rivers that are predicted to increase over time with climate change conditions? How do we make the groundwater and other water supplies that we have last longer through longer, more extensive droughts? Southern California right now is in the 24th year of drought. California as a whole, it's a few years, but Southern California has been 24 years of drought. And so we need to make every single drop of water that we have count and stretch as far as we can. And for us, especially in, California, and I'm not sure about Canada's environmental laws, but you have to make a commitment to the environment. You can't take all of the water out of the environment for people. You have to have that balance and withstand the natural landscape that, our citizens have said are important to us. So all of those different kind of what I would consider not really competing, but, parallel track needs, let's call them, have to be considered. And so putting that puzzle together, like I said, you're trying to solve for all of these different variables and many of them being unknown. So it's a real challenge. It's like a gigantic algebraic formula.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's always fascinated me about the infrastructure world in general is just how you've always got to be thinking long term. So it's this long term 30-year outlook, but at the same time, things are just constantly changing. So it's like trying to build long term success in this constantly changing environment where things change, every year. So Indra, tell us a little bit, maybe about some of the challenges you've faced and that you've mentioned. I'm just curious, is climate change, would you say that's a top concern for your agency as well, or is it not at that level?
Again, we know that climate change is a big topic, but its impacts comes in various degrees and shapes and forms, right? So the answer in general is yes, but again, depending on where these cities are located, some are very prone to flooding. In Ontario specifically, we are more prone to flooding and rain kind of events compared to fire and other thing in California, other kind of things. But like you said, there's a water temperature increase that has resulted in algae growth, that has resulted in additional treatment needs for certain systems and odor issues in wastewater systems and so forth. So the simple answer is yes, but is it really urgent that you need to attack it today? Most possibly no, but you now have to factor that in your planning. Now, if I spin this around, most of the government funding, whether it's federal or provincial funding, they are focused around climate change KPIs, right? So if your projects doesn't have a deliverable such as greenhouse gas reduction, such as energy efficiencies and so forth, you have a less chance of getting those fundings. Because remember, funding is a very competitive process, right? It's not given to everybody, like there's no quotas in there. So regardless of how you design the project, it has to be factored in now. So, even though I don't, some of us might not like to say, oh, this is being triggered by climatic change, but just to get that funding, I have to include that objectives in my project now. Now, as Heather said, when these systems are owned by a lot of small municipalities where they don't have human resources or technical strength or capacity to manage these projects, what Aqua has been doing is, because of our economies of scale, because of our coverage around the geographic area and our workforce spread around this huge geographic area, entire province, what we have started is like kind of bundling the projects so that, like I was talking about delivery of the projects, right? So if I have 15 projects in a span of 450-kilometer length, it's very difficult to find the crew that's going to implement and construct and deliver these projects. Just for example, digester cleanout, right? So if I have to do the 10 digesters cleanout in this 200-kilometer length, it's going to take a time. So what we have started doing is working with these multiple owners and try to see if we can line it up so that the same crew moves from one location to another location. And also there's efficiencies around procurement practices, there's efficiencies around cost savings and so forth. So to borrow Heather's terminology, we're trying to bring regional perspective. And again, point to be noted is we don't own this. So there's no commitment, there's no guarantees around those. We just try to bring it all together so that these issues are addressed. A lot of the facilities, obviously, those facilities which are prone to the flooding and things, there's an urgent need around, mitigating those factors. Just a day before yesterday, many parts in this Ontario faced a 15-minute, half an hour major storm. Some of the small towns in Ottawa and other areas, they still are out of power. I think we were told that it's going to be another week for them to resume power, and it was not forecasted. It was totally came out of blue, and then the path was totally unpredictable. So a lot of these smaller municipalities, they are out of power, and now should I call it climate change impacts? Yes, I agree with that, but a lot of people don't believe. And my explanation is whether you believe or not, it happened. So how do you address that, right? With the current prices of fuel, now how am I going to buy a diesel for 2 weeks of diesel generator running in my plant to keep it operational? So those are increasing the cost, and these long supply chain issues are basically escalating those issues. Maybe I was planning to do my diesel generator replacement 3 years from today. I might have to start thinking about doing it next year. So, some of these are basically fast tracking these needs.
Yeah, it reminds me last year in, we were headquartered in Austin, although not all my team is in Austin. But last year in February, there was that big winter storm which made the news. And, pipes that were not meant to accommodate freezing water were freezing and breaking. I had people on my team who were literally boiling snow to get water. It was like pandemonium in Texas at that point. And thankfully, everybody sort of came through it. But yeah, I think climate change is affecting everybody, no matter where you live. So Tom, I'd like to come back to you. So Heather mentioned something interesting, of course, which is the growth that you mentioned is I'm sure population growth, but I'm guessing there's also a lot of industrial growth, manufacturing, and so on, and those can be pretty water intensive. So how has that affected you, or other challenges you'd like to kind of hone in on and chat about?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think a lot of people, they really don't, and you started this presentation out with, Stephanie did, about people don't really give much thought to water other than I turn on the tap, there it is, and it works. And they don't understand how really fundamental it is. And one of the things when I'm talking to businesses, business owners, one of the things that I try to make clear is you have no economy without a water supply. It is that fundamental. You literally cannot manufacture some of the most important goods and services without a water supply. So with the investments in green infrastructure and the desire for more efficiency, it's a heavy dependence on chip manufacturing. And chip manufacturing, as Stephanie mentioned, requires a great deal of water, although they're very efficient. They look at reuse, they look at ways to do it, but still requires a significant and reliable water supply. So that's something that we are responsible to provide, that we make sure we understand what their needs are, both short-term and long-term, and then try to plan for that. Part of the project that I mentioned that we're doing, this $1.6 billion project that we're doing, we actually worked with surrounding communities, the city of Hillsborough, city of Beaverton, brought them into a partnership on this project, which helps buy down the cost by spreading the costs out over a larger population. But it's still very expensive for them and for us. And it is providing this water supply to these major chip manufacturers in the region. But yet these chip manufacturers, if you've paid attention to the news, they have national ramifications, right? So I kind of equate this to the local economy here is carrying the financial burden for something that has a national significance. And I really think we need to start understanding we wouldn't have done that like in World War II, where we said, Virginia is the one that produces ships, so they should pay for the ships, and then the rest of us get a benefit from it, right? That's not how it should work, but yet that is kind of what we're doing today. Mm-hmm. And we need to change that thinking. I will tell you, for us locally, what's been such a challenge for us has been inflationary costs. And this is tied to labor. It's tied to fuel supply and other supply chain issues. We were on track for years with what we had forecasted for the cost of this project. It was actually estimated early on at $1.3 billion. The district and our partners took aggressive actions, raising rates to help pay for this major investment. And then on December 15th, at about 5:45 p.m., I remember this that well, I was informed by my project manager that the most recent bids had come in on our project and had increased in cost by over $300 million. That is significant, and it was all tied to those three things I mentioned: labor, fuel, and supply chain issues, all putting pressure on inflationary costs. For us to absorb that kind of hit, our local ratepayers, we're looking at rate increases here in the next couple of years that are in the neighborhood of 20%. That is huge. And when you start thinking about the stresses on people's resources already, with mortgages where they're at and rent where it's at, this is not an insignificant deal. And people, before it's that, what do you need to survive? Water's at the top, right? It's that shelter's second. And literally people are having to make some tough choices as our rates go up. And I really think we have to change our thinking about this on a national perspective. We've got to make the funding more accessible to agencies that we can help our ratepayers.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great segue into our next slide, which was about funding. But I do also want to talk, as you were talking about, Tom, just with the cost and the supply chain stuff as well, which some of you have mentioned. So Indra, let's come back to you for a second. So I know there was a big bill passed about 5 years ago in Canada for a lot of different infrastructure programs, including things like getting broadband to rural communities. I think it was the largest infrastructure bill that Canada had ever had at the time as well. Well, I'm curious. You mentioned it a couple of times. What's the sentiment in Ontario? Do people feel like the government's investing enough? Or is it just the same story that you were mentioning, where you kind of, there's too much pressure, I guess, put on the smaller local agencies to really make up this gap between where the state of the infrastructure is and where it needs to be to serve the communities well?
Yeah, the good news, like you said, is in last 5 years, we have seen the government's focusing a lot on water, wastewater infrastructure. So it's a good news. But however, it has been lagging for last many years. So we are still, following that trail to catch up with other infrastructure. Now, municipalities own these assets, but remember, the municipalities also have streets and breezes and libraries and, recreational centers and so forth. So like I think Tom or Heather mentioned, a lot of these municipal leaders wants to, invest on these infrastructures where public directly access the services, because that can be seen, that can be felt, and people use it. Whereas, like Tom mentioned, water, wastewater are hidden behind the bushes or trees. Nobody sees it until you don't have the water, right? So that's why. And then a lot of these funding programs in past used to lump all infrastructure as one. So there's a big money being allocated for infrastructures, and then the municipal decision makers are told to pick your projects and apply for it. So obviously, if I have to pick between water, wastewater, and a library or a breeze or a road, I'm going to pick the breeze and roads because that's where people drive every day. And if there's a pothole, you're going to get 50 complaints compared to a wastewater system, right? So that's how we have been lagging. And now we have seen a little bit of increased focus on water, wastewater. Some of those money are just assigned for water, wastewater projects. Now, again, in water, wastewater, there's different infrastructure, linear and non-linear water towers and pipes and all those. So, now where do you prioritize, right? Because there's not a lot of money that you can address all. You have to choose and pick. So that's where it's headed. Is at least we are getting some, but now the fundamental other shift is, as you know, we are trying to move away the systems, and we are encouraging. We don't own it, so we are encouraging that the system owners move away from a system where the system, water wastewater system, is totally based on ratepayers, but also look for alternatives, avenues of revenues, whether it's a biosolids fertilizer revenue, whether it's a biogas and energy revenue, or wastewater heat recovery kind of avenues. We know that not all treatment systems can explore these revenue approaches, but some can, right? So we are trying to encourage the municipal system owners, like, you need to start looking at these other sources of revenue so that you minimize the burden or your dependence on just one stream of revenue, like Tom says, which has been lagging. If they have to increase and meet the operating cost to the net balance revenue every year, it might have to be increased by 20%, I don't know, 30%, right? Which is not popular at the end of the day. So there has to be some other creativity in how we do the work, how we compensate the expenses to incur the operating cost and so forth, and then obviously government funding. So we're also encouraging and trying to be a little bit more proactive on, okay, if I can add some other deliverables or objectives in my project. For example, if I'm doing a water tower project, but the funding program is only available for efficiency and optimization and innovation, can I do something different so that I can apply to this another special funding program to get the money for that? So we're trying to encourage the thought process around water infrastructure projects can also be innovative, can also be really fun. It doesn't have to be same old traditional scope of the project. And then we are also working with a lot of stakeholders, whether it's private, public stakeholders, around alternative delivery models, where we are trying to encourage private capital in the project on a performance base. So since last 3 years, we have been developing, we call it net zero resource recovery project, basically trying to bring in food organics into the wastewater treatment plants, and then convert the biogas into clean fuels, whether it's renewable natural gas and so forth. And in those kinds of projects, we are trying to bring private partners, so as a technology solutions provider, design build solutions provider, and then creating an avenue for them to invest a certain percentage of the total capital on a performance base, so that there's a shared risk approach, there's a shared investment approach, and a long-term partnership level. So we recently have a project that's approved towards implementation. We have a lot of other projects around that area too. So this is all being done to kind of minimize that pressure of one source of funding only, right? So let's explore multiple sources of funding. Again, these projects also have a partial federal government funding too, but also private funding. And Aqua, we are also trying to come up with these programs where we are trying to create alternative financing opportunities to see, okay, if we have a 20-year O&M agreement with you, Richard, but you don't have money to invest on this infrastructure, but we are operating this, right? So it's also our pain to operate this old aging infrastructures. We also want, if you are a car owner and I'm a driver hired by you, I don't like to drive an old car, not knowing where it's going to stop. But if I have options to kind of help you purchase a new car and I still get to drive it as your driver, maybe that's a win-win for both operating authority and a system owner. So we're trying to find how can we achieve that. Yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah, it's very interesting that, so I'm a bit of an amateur gardener when I have time. And so, a few years ago, I heard just the whole story about Milorganite, which is a product put out by the Milwaukee Water and Sewer District, and how just the whole story. It's a fascinating case study of how they came up with that idea to really push a commercial product to really meet their revenue shortfall ultimately. So Heather, one thing I wanted to ask everyone on the panel actually was just one thing I noticed just in the last few weeks is that it looks like the price of lumber has started to come down. Lumber is sometimes a leading indicator in construction and capital programs, and so for months we had this big run up on lumber. You couldn't get lumber. And we've just started. Are you seeing any respite to the inflation and the increased cost of goods yet, or is that still a big concern for the rest of the year and into next year when it comes to delivering your program?
Sadly, no. We haven't seen the prices start coming down yet. We have one, through our habitat conservation plan, we have about $300 million worth of habitat restoration, stream restoration, wetland restoration, all of these things that we need to do as part of our permit requirements for our water infrastructure projects. It's a package deal, right? You can't do one without the other. And so we've been planning and designing these streams for about 5 years now, 5 different streams. And we got the cost estimates, and they had gone up about 200%. And that was even if we could get all of the materials that we needed. And it was just staggering because this is a restoration project, right? Like we're trying to do something good. But the cost is just prohibitive. And, as far as our water infrastructure, we haven't even gone out to bid in quite some time because I think I'm scared to see the price tag on some of these things. But it's just really, really challenging. And, I just wanted to hit home one more time. What Tom was talking about, the economy, I look at it the same way. I think people don't understand in our traditional system of beneficiary pays. Oh, well, the people who live within that service area and get water out of that pipe into their faucet, they should pay, right? But the thing is that Southern California is an economic driver that radiates out through Sacramento, our capital, through the entire nation, through the globe. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. Agriculture of California, major economic driver for the whole nation. What does it mean to the economy of California and our nation and the global economy if we don't have a reliable water supply to sustain these industries? And these industries either just go, turn the keys and leave. Maybe they move to a different state. Maybe they move to a different country where they can get these resources more affordably. And so those are the type of economic questions that we're asking ourselves. And Indra, he outlined some really creative ways of financing. And that's where we are, is who can we have help pay for this project? Who has an incentive to have a renewable, reliable water source? What asset do I have that traditionally probably wasn't monetized, but now I need to monetize it so I can get some revenue to build these water projects? That's where we are. And again, this is very reactive. And so I think my biggest message is on all of these things, cost and climate change, we have to be proactive. We have to figure out what is the model that will work for the future and allow us to build the system that we need for the future and keep this, global engine going.
Yes, thanks. And again, that's another great segue over to our last slide on the topic. So I'm going to go back to Tom. And so we've heard about these challenges. I mentioned that, some of the pressure, I think, comes from what deciding what you have to deal with today while still keeping your eye on that long-term vision, because we're all members of the community and we want long-term success for our constituents who are our friends and family and business partners and those kind of things. So I guess, sum it up for us, Tom, when it comes to these things like climate change, population change, all of that. How are you addressing those and then still keeping your eye on that long-term plan for your community? And sorry, before you answer, Tom, folks, I'm seeing a couple of questions come in here. Keep them coming and we'll get to them in a few minutes. Go ahead, Tom.
So the way I addressed it is a lot of sleepless nights. It's one of these things where you're constantly trying to deal with the day-to-day and then trying to get, frankly, elected leaders at every level to understand how important and how big this issue is. Because frankly, that's where the long-term solutions lie. It's going to take some, frankly, political courage and less political ideology to solve these problems. without political support, these problems really do become insurmountable. And you know, I went into my career as an engineer really not wanting to be part of politics, yet I find myself right in the middle of politics, right? That's what I deal with on a daily basis. Just to, you know, to give it to people some idea of how tied this stuff is. Heather mentioned the agricultural supply and water supply there. One of the things that people don't think about is if you take something like California and you look that somewhere around 30% of the nation's food supply comes out of the Central Valley of California. Those are soils that you don't get to move. You don't, to go find other fertile soils is hard to do. And so when we are dealing with everything from where we are even building, where we're building new towns, new homes, if you're tilling under that valuable soil and putting pavement and concrete on top of it, that's kind of a lost resource forever. So we have to do better planning all the way around. We've got to think more long term about all this stuff because we are, you know, climate change is impacting us, and the reality is that we frankly have ignored it for decades. We've argued about nuances while it has continued to impact us. And at some point, as Indra said, we've got to set down the debate about this and say, whether we like it or not, it's happening. And we've got tons of evidence now to point to say, this is happening, and it's now impacting your personal water bill. It's impacting your personal food supply. And it's going to get worse if we don't start taking this very seriously and start making taking some very aggressive steps to say, okay, it's time. We can't continue to ignore these things. So in terms of long-term supply, right now, I'm trying to get through venues like this, people to understand it's time to stop debating and it's time to start doing. If we continue to debate these things, you know, the ride's going to get a lot rougher in the future. And I hate to be negative about that, but that is a reality.
Yeah, no,
Richard,
and very true. Go ahead, Heather.
What analogy I think most people will understand is that on a daily basis, Tom and Indra and I and all the other water managers of California and Canada and everywhere, we're dealing with the symptoms of climate change, and everybody has different symptoms. You know, Indra has flooding, I have drought, you know, all these different symptoms, but we still have the disease of climate change that also needs to be addressed. So it's got to be done in parallel, and you can't take your eye off of the disease just because you're constantly trying to manage these different symptoms. But at the same time, the symptoms are real and they're right in our face, so we have to deal with them. And so it's just a really complex situation to be in. And like Tom said, we can't take our eye off of it, or, you know, it is going to be much rougher in the future.
Yeah, and you know, I'm glad, Indra, what you mentioned, and I'll turn over to you for a final word in a second, but it's something I've heard from our water customers, just that it's sometimes hard to fight for airtime because it's under the ground and it's hidden, and the political will at, say, the city level is often geared, you know, towards, you know, the shiny bridge or even a new park. So the other utilities has a unique challenge in that they have to market themselves and make sure that they're seen as important, even though they're dealing with, I mean, I think we can all agree that water is more important than even electricity or a road to drive on. It's just more fundamental. So Indra, we're going to switch to questions in about 2 minutes time. But last word from you, Indra. How do we address that? How do we get people to understand the challenges we're facing in water?
So with due respect to Tom and Heather, at least here in northern part of the Americas, we, regardless of the political stripe, we all here agree that climate change is happening. Depending on the political stripe, the course of actions can be different, whether it's a carbon tax or something else. That's a different discussion. But I totally agree with Tom. I think everybody now, the leaderships of different political stripes, agree that if you don't address it today, it's just going to get expensive every year, and God knows how much it's going to go up, right? So that's common here. So that's why the federal government announced multi-billion dollars for 10 years, 20 years around funding a lot of these greenhouse gas mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency project. So it's all good. What I saw in last 5 years is collaboration is very important, because I've been advocating that in Canada, especially electric utilities, water utilities, and solid waste or waste management utilities, and even we have like water departments, wastewater departments, stormwater departments, a solid waste department operating as a totally different departments. So what we have been advocating is this all has to come together, because there's a lot of synergies, interdependency between all of these efficiencies in the service, and at the baseline, the investments. People are doing the same work 1 year on the stormwater, second year on the other sides, but if combined in a multi-year, long-term planning, then it can result in better efficiencies and better coordination. That's within the own employer. But outside of the employer also, we have started collaborating with electric utilities, gas utilities, and so forth, agricultural, and it's coming in all into realizing is what is good for the industry, what is going to, like Tom I think mentions a little bit about regulatory barriers. It is less discussed, but it is real too. It can significantly kill your infrastructure project if not done properly. It can add multi-year timeline to your project, escalating the cost by 500% and totally killing the project if not done correctly. So how do we work with the regulators? And on top of that, I think we forgot to talk about emerging issues. We talked about microplastics, we talk about PFAS and all those. So what's coming down the road? And I think US is doing a really good job around non-flossable standards around non-flossables around in US and Europe and Australia. We are following that. So what happens when those standards comes into the play? Because those are adding a lot of cost to our maintenance by damaging our pumps and other systems. So all these regulations going to come down the road. So how that means we need to invest more to address those upcoming, even regulatory wise, the phosphorus limits, the other limits are getting tightened every year as we move on. So when the regulatory framework starts getting more stringent, that means I need to invest on other treatment technologies to meet that regulatory. So that is coming at the cost. And like Tom and Heather said, it's not being paid by anybody else. It's being paid by the same ratepayers. And add the inflation, add the gas prices and everything else, especially in Toronto, house prices and everything else. That's even if you increase $5 every month in water rates, that's a massive upcry, So I think that's what we are trying to work in a collaboration to make all the decision makers understand is this is a collective problem. Let's not just look at it as a water system problem. Eventually, it hits everybody. So let's work together in delivery of the projects, in applying to the funding, and finding innovative ways of working together. So that we always look for efficiency. When I say efficiency, I'm not just talking about technological efficiency, Richard. I'm also talking about, procurement, administration, all sorts of efficiencies that comes along the way.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you. So I want to make sure we have enough time just to address a couple of questions. So I'm going to hand back to Stephanie. I just wanted to thank Tom and Heather and Indra for coming on and just sharing your stories. I think it's very valuable for our audience. Just to hear the similarities, maybe the differences in what they're facing, I think is very helpful. Thank you for being great public servants and looking after it, because just like everybody else, I rely on clean drinking water myself. So it really is a vocation in many ways, and there's just a plethora of things that you guys have to deal with. So thank you for everything you do. We really appreciated it. And I'm going to hand back to Stephanie.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of questions that came in. So one of the questions, we talked a lot about funding. So a lot of the loans offer 49%. how are we funding the rest? And I think you guys had mentioned it, but I don't know if any of either Tom, Heather, or Indra, if you can touch more on how do you fund the rest of your projects when you're only getting 49 to 50% of your funds?
So I'm using my reserves. We saved up a lot of money over the years while we were doing all the planning and permitting for a lot of projects. And so we were able to use our reserves, use that as matching funds towards grants. Although, to be honest, like Tom, I haven't seen a lot come my way. A few. We're still working on many, and also bringing in partners. So can I share the cost of this project with another agency? 30% split. Of course, they get 30% of the water also, but if you have to choose between a project and no project, I'm willing to share. So we're looking for partnerships and any funding source available.
And I'll second that with what she said. I mean, fundamentally, what we can't get through through any grants or loans, it's rates, and rates have to back the loans. So fundamentally, whatever these costs are, they get passed on to ratepayers, and that's what we use to address these.
Awesome. Okay, so next question. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. On the Canadian context, we have two levels of government. Usually, the feds provide about 50%, and the province matches it up by 25%. And usually, 25% needs to be spent by the owners, small municipalities, but we also have different agencies, the government agencies that provide low interest loans up to almost 75% of the capital projects.
Now, next question. Would you say that water conservation has played an increasing role in your long-term water supply planning? And what's the biggest barrier to implementing efficient programs?
So I'll start, and I know Heather probably has a ton to say here on this, but water conservation is always a critical part. It's always a part of our portfolio. One of the things, though, that I share with people is you have to understand our costs of delivering water are fixed, right? So even if somebody's using less water, which is great for the environment and it's great for the resource, and people should be doing that, my costs remain unchanged. My costs are tied to pipes and pumps and maintenance of the system, and it doesn't cost me less to run the system because I'm putting less water through it. So as a result, what happens is when people conserve, what can happen is what's called in the industry conservation death spiral has been referred to, whereas people save water, the costs, their individual costs, continue to go up because our costs are tied to the volume of water they use. So it's a constant balancing act of how much of the bill. In fact, I'm working on this right now. How much of the bill that we provide to people, how much of it should be a fixed portion versus how much of it should be tied to their volumetric usage. If I put too much emphasis on volumetric usage, as they reduce their usage, then I've got to turn back and increase their costs. So it's really confusing, it's really complex, but fundamentally, conservation's always part of the equation.
Yeah, and I would just add, in our region, we've actually had a flat water use for quite some time. If you chart water use over time compared to population growth and economic growth, water use has stayed flat. So we're doing well in terms of being efficient, of doing the right thing. But like Tom said, the system itself has been designed for people to use water to some level, some responsible level. We have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in recycled water systems where we take wastewater and we put it into groundwater recharge basins. And so it kind of goes through this circular loop through the system. if there's less wastewater being produced, that's less recycled water going through our groundwater recharge system, less water going in the ground. So like all of those things have to be taken into consideration before you put very stringent water conservation mandates on the areas, because everyone has different components of their system that will respond differently. And to be honest, a lot of our retail agencies, I'm a wholesaler, so I deliver water to 15 retailers. They are not structurally set up to have major water conservation right now for those very reasons that Tom just said. In the end, what will happen if we just tried to mandate our way through it is that those fixed costs would be applied to everyone. And those people who are using less water right now, their bill goes up, because they're now taking more of the fixed costs of the entire system. And so we have to think that through. Like that's part of the long-term planning that we're talking about, is how do we build water conservation into our system in a very sustainable way, while also meeting the needs of the environment, meeting the needs for groundwater recharge and irrigation where we're using it, and also have a fair and equitable distribution of costs.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Tom and Heather. It's the same scenario here. It's a two edges, knife conservation. Like Tom said, the utilities are not promoting aggressively because then there's a loss of revenue. You need to have a minimal revenue to operate your system, but they also want to encourage these kinds of education and awareness. So balanced approach, I would say.
And it is already the end of our webinar, so I want to thank all of our panelists. And like Richard said, thank you for everything that you guys do, because we do need clean water. And as Tom had mentioned, this is something that everyone in our audience, we all need to get together to pre-plan. So I want to wish everyone a good rest of the day, and thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. It was fun.
Thank you.